We knew there was going to be the folks that were going to jump on board in 2 seconds because they knew what we were talking about and it made sense to them. We knew there was going to be the in-betweeners like, I don't know about this, but I think I'm falling into place. And we also knew there were going to be the folks that were going to say, yeah, no, this is not for me. Those kind of things have happened, where people opt themselves out, or sometimes we need to nudge folks because we are intentionally trying to create a culture that's more humanistic, that values equity and inclusion.
Hi, and welcome to the Solar for All podcast, a podcast focused on the issues of race, class, justice, equity, and our solar industry, and how the things that we're trying to do to get better. I'm your host, Geoff Greenfield, and I want to direct you to the show notes and other great resources at our website, solarforall.show, and that's spelled out SHOW. With me today is our guest, Irasema Garcia, and she is coming to us from San Diego, where she's been with Grid Alternatives for 9 years. She's currently the director of the Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity team at Grid, and she's got a master's in public administration from San Diego State University and has her BS from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I've been talking, getting ready for this podcast a bit with her, and it's going to be a great one. She is in the middle of the subject matter that we're focused on here, and I hope that we have lots of information to share with our listeners, and we can inspire folks to do better, because that's what this podcast is all about. Welcome, Irasema.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to this for sure.
I was just going to start by saying, how did you get into solar, or how did you get into Grid? You've done a bunch of things and with nonprofits and a bunch of different organizations, but what led you to our world in solar?
I think I actually joke with my sister that I auditioned for my job for 1.5 years before I even got it. At the time, I was actually consulting and I was teaching coaching for managers. And one of our staff was actually in the session and we connected some dots like, wait, I think y'all were working in my neighborhood. And we just kind of moved forward. And at some point, they had a position that opened up. And I thought, let's try this. Because it actually was part of my vision board to be in the green industry somehow. And this is how Grid came into my sphere. But it's been 9 very interesting years. I came in as a community person, and I think it definitely has morphed into this particular position. But of course, that's also connected to the work that I've been doing for a long, long time. So it made sense for me to be the person to help us transition into a more equitable organization across the board.
Yeah. So as someone who's been focusing on that work for quite a long time, what's your reaction to, I think, what we might call the Great Awakening of, I guess, a broader bunch of folks seeing what you've been kind of seeing for maybe all your life?
I think it's one of those things that I am glad that is happening. And I think at the same time, there's frustration that it's finally happening for some folks. So one of the things we talk a lot about in this work is that it's a both and. Within this system, we have been taught that it's either or. Either you are my friend or you are not my friend. And it's a multiple thing. It's both and. Very glad that a lot of folks are waking up to the things that a lot of us BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have known for a long time. And also, let me actually just kind of share something that a lot of people have said. We've tried it your way for over 400 years. And this is like the general way, the royal we. We've tried it your way for over 400 years. Now can we do it our way? Because I think there's a lot of things that we've been untaught or have been forced to unlearn about how we look and operate within America. So I think there's a whole lot of work to do. And I think there's a level of let us lead the way. Because I think the way we have operated is that white folks were leading the way and telling us what was up, but we're the ones who knew all the other things that needed to happen. So this is where like the double edge comes in. One of the other things we talk about within our organization and in the work is I don't want allies. I actually want accomplices, because the whole thing with allies is that I myself can claim membership to like 25 different groups that I'm an ally to. What I want are accomplices, folks that have been doing the work and are ready to jump in and support and advocate in the way that they've been asked to support and advocate. So it's like accomplices are the folks that are ready to go. I said a whole lot, but what do you think?
No, I love that. I'm trying to think of where I first bumped into the word accomplice. I've been on my own journey of education and I guess waking up more than I thought I was already woke. And a lot of the things you just said resonated quite a bit with me. Um, I myself am a natural leader in an organization or a group, and I've been kind of groomed by our society as a white male, straight, to go to the front and lead the charge. And one of my kind of explorations here is what's it like to be in the back? What's it like to, let some Black folks and people of color take the lead and see how I can support and maybe augment and accomplice, be an accomplice. And that's been, part of my journey, which is, a small part of this. Although there's probably plenty of, white, relatively privileged folks, men and women, that are listening to this and that are also on their own journeys, and they're, more and more than ever trying to figure out, what is the right way to help. There's a lot of great resources there. We're going to put, there's a couple of them that were on the page from Grid Alternatives. We'll link to that in the show notes. I don't know, any really good books for folks if you met somebody on a bus and said, "Here's an item you can study up on. Here's a good resource."
I think that there's a few what I call beginning books that actually help people start thinking about this. And one of them is So You Want to Talk About Race with Ijeoma Oluo, which is pretty wicked awesome because I think she goes into like the foundational pieces of it. The other one that I actually didn't put on my list, but I think is an important one is actually Robin DiAngelo's book. And there actually have been a ton of critiques in the sense of, yes, she's talking to white folks, and she's also like saying the things that a lot of BIPOC folks have been saying for a long time, and the person getting credit for it. But in any case, it is a valuable book that I think some people will hear more because it's coming from a white woman. And I think the last one that I kind of put in like this foundational list would be Layla Saad's Me and White Supremacy is the title of the book. I think that's another one where you actually go through a workbook and start to dissect the things that you have in your mind and deconstruct. Um,
Yeah, I mean, you use the word deconstruct. It's almost like, philosophy or metaphysics. If you look at the world a certain way for so long, something else is different, and that's just your worldview. And most people, most of the time, unless they're academics perhaps or getting involved in this work, they don't see how powerful a force their worldview is. And I think that deconstructing your own worldview, maybe with curiosity and humility, starts to open the doors to perhaps being open to a different way than the last 400 years, which I would imagine aren't even going very well for some of the rich white folks on top. Because if you take a morality question in place, or what kind of a life do you really want, I think there's a lot of really unhappy people in all stations of life and in all positions. And I'm ready to try a different way. I don't know what it's probably be some trial and error.
what you just said connects to the whole system of white supremacy. Within this system, we have been taught that I need to always be achieving and be one-upping whatever I've done before. We always need to be one-upping each other. So I think I for sure am on the journey of trying to discover a different way of existing. And I think, we have so many loaded words within our I mean, even when you break down goal setting, right? Like we ask little kids, like, what do you want to do when you grow up? How old are they when we start already pushing the achievement situation? And I actually joke, but very seriously call myself a recovering overachiever, because when you talk about these habits of white supremacy, please know I was one of the really good ones, and I had to learn and deconstruct how I was going to exist and how I was going to value myself. And I think, bringing this back to grid, we're trying to deconstruct our culture. so that we're more humanistic, so that we actually care about how you are feeling about your work. How are you interacting with your coworkers? And those are the, like, this is where I come into play in the solar industry, right? So I just trying to figure out how do we do this? And I think one of the keys that you also mentioned is how do we do this work with humility? Because it can make you cry on the regular.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been focused on this for in this specific position for 3.5 years or so. What are some of the things that you've learned recently? Now that you're really getting into it and trying to bring this to folks within Grid as well as probably I'm going to guess a broader community beyond Grid alternatives.
So actually, let me paint a kind of like the trajectory. When we first started doing this work, and I'm not joking, like day 2 of my position, someone said, "Great, now tell us what to do." And it's like, no, that's not how this work works. And what we ended up intentionally doing is actually pushing folks to do their own work, because at every level, you have to do it in 3, or no one has to nothing. But it's important to do it in 3 because you're focusing on yourself and your own learning and your own journey, focusing on your team, whether that's your department or even, your region, which is something we have within Grid, different offices. And the last one is how are we trying to make Grid, an organization, a better place. So the place where we are on the journey now is how do we integrate. For a long time, it was important to actually have people focus on equity, inclusion, and diversity as a thing all by itself. But now we're at the point where that's important, and let's figure out and dissect how EID, equity, inclusion, and diversity, fits in everything that we're doing. So that's where we are in the journey, and also connecting to now externally. What ends up happening with us is sometimes I feel like we're some sort of special unicorn, because when we're working with outside organizations, they have no idea what we're talking about. So what ends up happening is that our team, our staff, our BPOC staff, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, end up having to do all the emotional labor to bring people up to speed. So we're also in the process of creating a document to say with folks like, hey, this is who we are. Can you do a little bit of homework before you start working with us? Because we want to work with you. And we also don't want to torture our staff with having to teach you all the things that we're focusing on that we find important.
A cheat sheet of getting up to speed quickly. I'd imagine somebody gets hired at Grid. Part of the onboarding is this as well. A lot of the work that people have been doing for a while, they're up here, and somebody new comes into the organization needs to catch up pretty quickly.
And I would even say this is like a multiple level things. We have plenty of staff that uh, came in because of our reputation for this work. We also have staff that can actually say, oh, I didn't know the words for what you're talking about, but I have so much lived experience, so I know exactly what you're talking about. So we have a
Mm-hmm.
combination. I think one of the things that I am appreciating is folks jumping in and saying, please, can you give me a 101 session? And at the same time, I also have staff um, pretty much pleading, like, please, please don't make us do 101. Like, have it, but don't make us do it, because there's a level of having to, do the work over and over again. So we do have the spectrum of folks. I think one thing that's really important to say, and I also say it with caution because folks may not respond well to this, that when we started this work, we knew something was going to happen. We knew there was going to be the folks that were going to jump on board in 2 seconds because they knew what we were talking about and it made sense to them. We knew there was going to be the in-betweeners, like, I don't know about this, but I think I'm falling into place. And we also knew there were going to be the folks that were going to say, yeah, no, this is not for me. So those kind of things have happened, where people opt themselves out, or sometimes we need to nudge folks because we are intentionally trying to create a culture that's more humanistic, that values equity and inclusion. And I also just want to add that there's a whole generation of folks that come in and challenge me and challenge us on the regular. right? So simple things like actually saying our pronouns was something that folks pushed for, and I'm glad for it. And now no one blinks about saying their name and their pronouns when they start speaking in a meeting. So there are a lot of beautiful things that have happened within Grid, and I think at the same time are creating different levels of engagement. We have affinity groups. These are groups where folks can just come and be. And I think that's important. Like right now, we are not asking people to tell us what we're doing wrong. We just want you to be in the space so that you have a refuge. And we have plenty of staff that say they go to those groups for that once a week, every couple of weeks, once a month, depending on the group. We also have like policy teams where we decide things for equity, inclusion, and diversity. So I have, national folks, I call it the national EID group. So we have, senior leaders that come into that group, regional leaders that help us make decisions. We have equity and inclusion and diversity reps, regional representatives that check in with me on the regular to let me know what's happening. And we talk to each other about what we can do to move our regions along, move the teams along. We also have something that I call the Jedi Academy. And please know, who does not want to be a Jedi? To have a Jedi Academy is pretty cool. So that's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the Jedi Academy focuses on learnings and lessons that we need to understand better as an organization. So, for example, I'm going to say this very broadly, but I think it'd be important for people to look it up. The Third Reconstruction that we are on right now as a country. We think about the first and the second Reconstruction, civil rights being one of the second. So now we're in the third. We had a justice system and mass incarceration session a couple of weeks ago, and how that impacts Grid, as we work with folks that were formerly incarcerated. So we have all of these different entities where people can hopefully jump in and do work and just participate. And that's just the big groups. There's a whole lot other things that we're working on to try to engage our staff and shift things. And even then, on the regular, I still hear, I don't know anything of what's happening, and it's like, okay, let's bring you in. But it's a broad spectrum that we're doing, trying to support people.
Wow, this is really amazing. I've had a bunch of podcast interviews with a bunch of really interesting people around this subject, and none of them have been quite like this. I finally found someone who is, there's probably plenty of folks like you, thank goodness, and I want to meet more of them. But you are leading the charge here, and you've got some boots on the ground experience that is so useful to other well-intended people that say, I know there's a problem. I know my organization can get better. I want to be part of it getting better. I'd like to have hopefully more resources and more support for folks to learn from each other and not have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Although it sounds like you've been inventing the wheel with your peers and friends and comrades, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's how we get there, is everyone's doing it themselves, doing the work, like you said earlier.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I've noticed is that some folks are accustomed to talking to everyone about this all the time, and some folks don't talk to anyone about these things all the time. And we can make some generalities of like which pockets folks may fit into, but ultimately in my brain, in my everything, this is everything. It is so foundational to how we interact with each other as human beings. Who has a positional and power to engage in conversation. That's one of the things that I find quite interesting, where someone's like, oh, we are just people, let's just have a conversation. There's so many things that come into play the second that we start talking to each other, or even the second that we see each other, right? So we even talk about those things within the organization. How does trauma come into play? I've had staff tell me this is the first place that I can be, because in my 50 plus years of working, I've had so much trauma of being a Black person in the workforce, right? So all of this comes into play on every day, frankly. And one of the things I also wanted to share with you about this work is I think it's kind of cool, and at the same time, it's a reality check. If you were to say this work is a 12-inch ruler, right? I've actually have heard that this work takes 7, 10 to 12 years to actually go into true cultural change. If you ask anyone that knows grid, they think, remember 1 to 12, they think we're at inch number 10. That grid is so far ahead that we're throwing everyone out because we are so good at what we're doing. I've asked this question of staff, and I agree with them. We're at inch 3.5 because there's so much more work that we need to do. And I really appreciate staff saying that because I agree with them 5,000,000%. We're at inch 3.5, my friends. We have done a lot of work, not taking away any of that credit, but so much more that we need to do in order to actually make a dent.
Wow. Would it be safe to say that Grid is a social change organization that happens to do solar?
That actually is a question that we have asked ourselves many different ways, many different times. We are trying to bring social change. I remember at one point actually saying to ourselves, do we deserve the word justice? Right? Like, I think we could say we have earned equity, we have earned diversity, we have earned inclusion. Can we say justice? Can we say social change? And I think maybe that's part of the beauty, right? If we claim it, that's a little bit of, I don't know, I want to say arrogance. So like, we're working towards these things. We are a work in progress and moving the solar industry, moving the agenda, right? And actually, I want to say moving humanity, not agenda, because agenda is temporary, right?
Yeah. Well, again, moving humanity. You all touch, I should probably look this up, thousands of volunteers. There's folks I know that are doing X, Y, and Z in solar. And I said, how'd you get into solar? They said, well, I wanted to get into it. Grid Alternatives was active in my community. I volunteered, and that was a resume filler. And I got some hands-on experience, and I got some confidence. I met somebody. I don't know how many thousands. That's maybe not in the hundreds of thousands, but over time, probably hundreds of thousands of folks from all walks of life. But a lot of them, white, privileged, upper middle class, educated folks have come through the grid program. And that's a lot of folks that you might have taught a little bit about solar to, but maybe you've also sprinkled in some social change.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair statement. One thing I didn't mention is before I was in this particular position, I was an outreach coordinator. So help working with families and working with our construction crew for these installs, and that was the regular comment that I heard. Grid helped me do this thing, and I think that's pretty awesome. And I think uh, that is part of how we have gained our reputation. Our construction crew is awesome because along with installing solar systems, they're teaching people. And I loved it when I was doing installs, and I didn't do a ton, but it's one of those where I really appreciated the experience. Our construction crews are really awesome.
Yeah, some of our listeners, believe it or not, a small subset might not really know what Grid Alternatives is and what kinds of things you all do. We'll have a link in the show notes, and you can get a deep dive. But can you give a quick overview of the diversity of projects and things and what the Grid model is?
Yeah, I can actually. I won't give a perfect picture, but definitely give you a big, broad overview. We actually started as a single family solar installer. And what we try to do is make that a no cost experience for our homeowners. So we work in the neighborhoods that for profit solar companies won't ever work in. So we actually, fun fact, one of our colleagues once said, do you realize that we have jobs because of redlining? Right? So when you talk about the history of redlining in this country, we work with those maps on the regular. Those are the maps those are the places we go to where other folks won't go to. The neighborhoods that have been uh, disinvested, ignored, frankly. So yeah, we do single family, multifamily housing. We, of course, do the volunteer component, the trainee component. We actually have folks that come into the organization that are re entering community that were formerly incarcerated. We do community solar. And if I remember correctly, that's mostly in our Colorado office, but it's expanding to other components, other parts. So we do a lot, but ultimately, we want to bring renewable energy to everyone, right? And I very, very comfortably say, like, like our people, our communities, our folks that we're helping kind of bridge the gap so that they can also be part of this. But yeah, I think at one point we could claim that we were the only nonprofit. And I don't think we can claim that anymore. I think there are others, but we for sure are the largest nonprofit that does this work.
You all have a great reputation. I've hired grid people before, and my peers and friends in solar companies across the country. You get 3 resumes, and one of them says, grid volunteer service or a longer term position with grid. That's a good thing. You guys have a great reputation for quality and integrity and safety, and I guess I hadn't thought of it before, but I think I'd like to have some grid folks be part of our organization so we can tap into that DNA in terms of the Jedi issues that we're all working on right now. Everyone's coming from different spots, and I think that organizations like Grid are really integral to helping move our country, move our society, our humanity forwards, and get some solar installed along the way. Building equity for a family, a lower income family, and giving them solar on their roof, and they can have basically free electricity or majority of their electricity generated on their roof rather than money going out the door and out of the community.
Well, I think ultimately, like one of the examples that was shared was electric car, right? When you think of the cost of gasoline, it doesn't matter what your income is, gasoline is going to cost the same across the board, right? So ultimately, a family who isn't making a ton is going to end up paying a larger percentage of their income on fuel to get to work. So I think that is just one of those examples of this work fits and hits many layers of the different constructs that we have ultimately.
The quote that I was going to bring up was is interesting. Underserved, under-resourced communities and communities of color disproportionately bear the burden of environmental injustice and climate change. I guess there's 2 pieces that I wanted to unpack or hear your thoughts on. One is on not just communities of color, but also under-resourced. Was that intentional, or is that something that came later?
Well, let me kind of paint a picture of this whole thing. There's been a lot of words that have been put on us that we have never asked for, right? So when I was doing outreach and working with our families, please know that the whole notion of calling someone a low-income family is offensive, right? So I think, and when you ask, like when you talk to the family, they don't see themselves as low-income people. So this is one of those situations where words have been put on us, words have been put on folks that they've never chosen for themselves, and under-resourced was one of those. The challenge, of course, is not everyone knows what the heck it means to be under-resourced, right? So when we are talking to funders, we are talking to potential corporate sponsors. When we say under-resourced community, they're like, huh? And we have to go back to the words that they're used to, which is low-income families. They're like, oh yes, got it, right? So those are the kind of things that we are trying to shift culturally. How do we start looking at our communities as asset-based versus deficit-based? And I think a lot of times we are comfortable, and I mean, we as a society are comfortable looking at folks as deficit-based, right? I am coming to help you, which goes back to white supremacy. I'm coming to save you. Let me save you. And when people don't like the way that you are saving them, we get mad. What's wrong with you? I'm trying to help you. And you can't see that? So I think that's kind of where the under-resourced communities, these are folks that have been intentionally ignored due to policy, due to decisions that other folks have made that they were not part of.
And society points to them and says, "Oh, they're in that situation because they don't work hard. They're in that
Absolutely.
situation because they make wasteful decisions with resources." Yeah, there's a lot of judgment, and it's all part of this story. It's part of the fabric of our economy to say, just like you were talking before about being an overachiever. We're trained to be overachievers, and we're also trained to see someone with less than us and say, "Well, it's because of X, Y, and Z. It's their fault." I think that's the big learning curve for a lot of folks, is to realize that it's not necessarily their fault. It might actually be a structural, systematic racism that is designed to I mean, that's hard for a lot of people to grab. And I think more and more people are getting exposed to that approach and starting to realize and wake up to it.
This actually is a really good segue to share a couple of organizations that are doing some really good work connected to this. Race Forward is one of those organizations that very explicitly talks about individualistic perspective versus systemic perspective. And the other one is REI. Please know that I too was confused. I thought it was the store, and it's not. It's the Racial Equity Institute. And the Racial Equity Institute focuses a lot on history that made these systems. And one of the really great analogies that I appreciate was, let me just paint it for you the way I learned it. So if you look at a picture of like a dead fish in a lake, you're like, oh my goodness, poor fish, what happened to that fish? Then zoomed out to a larger picture where you actually see hundreds of dead fish in a lake. And you don't start thinking, oh, poor fish. You start thinking, what is happening with this lake? Right? So a lot of the work that we do is fish work, that we're focusing on that one fish, we're focusing on that one person and the choices they made or didn't make, versus looking at the lake and actually trying to figure out what is happening with this lake that is impacting all of these fish. And I recently had a conversation with one of our founders, Erica Mackey, about that. And we started to connect the dots that even though our work is important as an organization and we need to continue that work, one could say that we are the fish. And part of our work, just as important, is taking care of the lake, which is our country, our states, our policies, so on and so forth. So, how do we both and all of this? I'm still going to continue to be Grid's person. I actually say that my customers are 350 staff. That's my customer. And how do we focus on the actual lake of our country and the solar industry, right?
Wow, that's a great metaphor. And I'm going to be checking out the REI as well as Race Forward. We'll have links to those organizations in our show notes. Probably a lot of good, interesting thinking to be done after reading some of that stuff. Wow. So the second part in that quote from you was talking about the burden of environmental injustice and climate change. And I think that folks that are starting to study about climate change realize that poverty and folks at the edge are going to be hit or are being hit faster and harder and have fewer resources. But I don't know if a lot of folks really understand about environmental injustice. Are you talking about things like where we cite or where we historically have cited polluting infrastructure, those kinds of things? Or what are some examples of environmental injustice that people might want to be aware
I
of?
think it's a combination, right, of like who's going to have the advocating power to say, not in my neighborhood, right? Who's going to have the resources to push back? Who's going to have the attorneys to actually, push some of those things away, and who doesn't, right? So they're actually, at least in San Diego, and I'm with a lot of different partners, intentionally working with communities to help them push things out, to change policies so that it's not a multi versus just like homes, so that the pollution rate can go down. And I think that's one of the reasons why we exist in particular neighborhoods as well, right? Reducing fossil fuels and actually increasing solar in different neighborhoods. So I think it's a combination of advocacy, who hasn't had the resources to do that. Um, so yeah, and I think the other piece, we also know the value of land, right? A beachfront property is not going to get some sort of refinery next to them on the regular, where it's a lot easier to put it in another neighborhood where maybe people won't notice. And we have so many examples of like, if we just do this quietly, maybe no one will notice, right? So how do we actually become active citizens? And I think that's actually one of those things that I get cranky about, when people want credit and cookies for actually doing good things. And it's like, no, it's all our job, my friend. It is not about you getting extra credit because you volunteer. I would even go as far as saying, I hate the word charity, because there's this level of benevolence and I'm helping you. It's like, no, it is your duty. it is all of our duty to do this work one way or another. So it's like, please don't ask me to give you cookies, or don't ask anyone to give you cookies, for doing something that's important that we should all be part of.
How can we make everybody believe that? I mean, that whole concept of service based on humanity. This is my duty as I don't even want to use the word citizenship because that implies borders. Really, it's global humanity. These are my brothers and sisters, and we're on this ride together. And I can't let that happen. It's just it's a morality issue.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's part of it. The way we handle a lot of things in this country is looking at it as a moral issue. And how about we take that label of moral and look at it more as like a public health? Because I too breathe the same air that the other people are breathing, so it's impacting all of us. I think the other piece is connecting to what I was sharing earlier about the three levels. Doing your work, we could just say that the middle part could be like your career, your family, and then the last piece is making the world a better place, and what are you doing for that, right? So looking at it as like those three things all the time versus right now I'm only worrying about this. Even when we take our kiddos to school, there are a whole lot of issues that come into play that impact all of us. How do we talk about everyone at school? How do we engage our families and the people that we are around with on a regular basis? And this actually reminds me that every BPOD kid that I know has some sort of story of how they learned they were less than. And it was also not uncommon to have that the teacher, be the one that reminded you you were less than. So I think it connects to everything.
Wow. Yeah, we've got so much work to do on that ruler. Maybe grid might be around 3. I think the general public is below 1 inch. I think we've got so much room to improve, and yet it seems like we're actively working, the royal we, uh, to go in the wrong direction, or to go in what I believe is the wrong direction. We're teaching competition. We're teaching zero sum games. We're teaching achievement, achievement, achievement. And then with regards to that whole concept of service, I would say that what we're teaching in the majority culture here, and a lot of it in schools and college, is forget service, get ahead, get yourself ahead.
Yep. And I think we are suffering for it as a country because of that. Part of what I do is trying to figure out with our team, how's the mental health of our staff. Right now we're talking about I'm blanking on the word, but I want to call it they're actually, I think they're calling it the Great Migration. People leaving their jobs at a very high level right now. And it's not just grid, it's an entire country. And part of it is people reevaluating how they want to connect to work, evaluating what is important to them, and what is big on that particular like screen is mental health. We are focusing on mental health in ways that we never have, and at the same time sorely ill-equipped to deal with it. So I think when we talk about within the spectrum of white supremacy, within this whole notion of trying to be overachievers, folks' mental health is suffering amazingly, like terribly.
And I think people attribute it to COVID. It's basically the COVID experience, and maybe it's also the combination of George Floyd and the summer of the riots and putting white supremacy and racism front and center in people's screens for the most part. I think the combination. I've heard a lot of folks saying, you know what, I'm reevaluating what's important to me. I'm reevaluating how I want to live, and I think it's probably a positive thing. I think if we keep on going on that hamster wheel, kind of with inertia, and keep doing things the way we've always done them, that's not necessarily progress or change. I don't know if this is progress or change. It's a bumpy ride.
Well, this is what I was referring to, the third reconstruction, that we are reevaluating a lot of things in our
Mm.
country, what it means to operate. And I think what I'm taking from what you said, we're going backwards, is people trying to maintain that power and control of how the system has been and how it has worked for them. I would even go back and rename the riots to the uprisings that help bring light to a lot of things that we have known for a long time, right? So we've known about the inequities with healthcare, and COVID for sure has brought light to that, right? Who is impacted? Who doesn't have proper health care? So I think George Floyd's murder and what's happened with COVID, no way am I saying it is a good thing, because it is not, but it most definitely has helped us see things that we have turned our heads to and have not paid attention to ultimately. So I think that is important. And I think this is where the awakening part comes in. We humans always want to go back to the simple, the things that we understand that we don't have to worry about. So we have to, that's called habituation, right? So what we're trying to do is to not habituate and create something new that's actually going to be more equitable and inclusive to everyone around us. And I think there's also connecting to what you were saying earlier about taking care of your own. How does your own become bigger? I think that is one of those solutions, because I could say my own is maybe 13 people, but no, no, no. My own is maybe all of San Diego, all of the state. We can keep going, all of grid, right? So how is my own ginormous? Because the way we take care of our own is probably really good. And how about we treat that, we do those same behaviors with everyone else and other folks?
I think that this is like a movie or a book, this conversation here. There's so many ideas that we're throwing around and that you're throwing at us and our listeners. There's a lot of good stuff here. And I appreciate how deep of a thinker, how thoughtful you are, and also how you're willing to point out little things, small things, but really important things. My use of the word riot. Did you see how quickly that came and went in my mind? And words have power. And by saying something is a riot, well, that describes it one way. Saying it's an uprising or a revolution says it another way. Yeah, there's so much left to do and so much work to be done. But I'm grateful that we've got people like you and organizations like Grid trying to figure it out bit by bit. And thanks so much for being on my show. We could go on for a long time, but we only have so much time. I think we'll let me throw it back to you. Is there anything that we didn't cover that, since you've got the megaphone here, that you want to get out or throw out? We've got a little bit more time before we get into the wrap up section.
Well, I think part of it is and I love this royal we thing. We can't ever separate ourselves from this work. We can't ever think, because I actually have had conversations with staff where they see this work as, oh, it's not a white thing, it's actually a people of color issue. And one of our staff said to me recently, which I found uh, endearing. She said, oh, and it was a white woman, I'm part of the diversity. And I was like, yes, you are. Right. So a lot of times we think of diversity as something that's separate and not thinking of it as we are all part of this thing that we need to figure out. And even if it's as simple as who has the resources for us to do this, and it's not, there are different ways to look at those resources. And part of it is different ways of thinking. The way we think in this country is shocking to the rest of the world. The way we prioritize is extractive, right? We talk about capitalism. Well, capitalism doesn't think of me and try to take care of me. Capitalism tries to get everything it can out of me. So I think that is one of those things that we cannot separate ourselves from all of this.
It's everything, and we're talking about solar. I got into solar because of sustainability for a variety of reasons, but at the heart is sustainability. And what good is having a clean energy system if we don't have a bunch of people loving and caring for one another, to enjoy the light bulbs and the heat and the electric cars. So sustainability really is all about us surviving as a species. We are interdependent animals, and we can't, go it alone. And if we can't figure out how to do it together, we're not. It's not. Things don't look very good. So I'm glad that you're part of the journey of all of us trying to figure out how to do it together, how to stick together, how to learn and grow together and support each other. Um, Wow. Good podcast today. Let's wind down a little bit with the Better Together section. This is where our guests get to share some favorite authors or thinkers with our audience. Anybody that you're ready to
Yeah, well,
tell
I
us about?
actually shared earlier, so you want to talk about race as one of the resources. One of the things that I did in the beginning of the pandemic was I went on a reading marathon of a lot of equity and inclusion books. And at some point, I actually hit a wall and I couldn't do it anymore. It just became too much for me. Um, but then I also found It's Been a Minute with Sam Sanders. It's a podcast. And what I appreciate about Sam Sanders is that it's a combination of still equity, inclusion, and diversity resources and conversations that are really important. And it's fun. And I love it. It's one of those podcasts where I know I'm still going to learn and have some fun while I'm at it. So I wanted to advocate for Sam Sanders because he's pretty wicked awesome for sure.
All right. Well, I'll put that on my playlist and give a listen. How about a piece of advice or wisdom that you'd like to pass on to our listeners?
Here, this is where when I was reading and prepping for this, I was like, okay, here's what I want to say. This is a lifelong journey. And if you're not willing to be on it, get out of the way because you will be causing more harm. So it's like making the commitment to actually do this work.
And a reminder that if you're not doing the work, you're part of the problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things that helps on the journey, at least helps me and a lot of people I know, is music. And I'm curious if you've got some songs for the 1+1 Better Together playlist, which is listeners can tune in and find us on Spotify. And what do you got? Do you have an old standby, or basically just what are two songs you'd like to put on our playlist?
So this is a fun one for me because I appreciate music. And I was actually in a workshop and the facilitator was playing Bill Withers. And there are a lot of Bill Withers songs like you just can't be sad listening to them. And the one that I put on the list was Lovely Day. Like, I think that is my favorite. And it has a tune, moves you along. And the one that I want to throw in and date myself as a Gen Xer is The Cure. Pretty much name the song, I will love it because The Cure was my thing when I was in high school and still is to this day. So anything by them. One of the ones that what is that song that I listen to all the time? Pictures of You. The Cure, Pictures of You. So all of The Cure, one,
All
two,
right.
that one.
It could be anything.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, all of The Cure.
Yeah.
All right. I'm a fellow Gen Xer, and you should have seen me with my flock of seagulls haircut back in high school. But
Yep.
Irasema, thanks again for being the person you are and doing the work you're doing. The world is a better place. There's lots of folks like you out there, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you to our sponsor, Third Sun Solar and Amicus Solar. And thanks mostly to our listeners. This is really trying to be a movement, getting this information out there. So if you care about these issues, please promote, share, put it on your LinkedIn or your socials, and stay tuned. If we're going to, I'm going to change it up. I used to say if we're going to be successful in the fight against climate change, we're going to need to learn to be more inclusive. I think it's not about climate change. I think if we're going to be successful about surviving as humanity and thriving, not just surviving, but achieving the happiness that I think we could have, we need to get together and work together and be more inclusive and supportive and loving of each other.